Hey everybody, and happy 4th of July to everyone listening in the US. I mean, I guess happy 4th of July, whoever you are, but it's a holiday here in the United States. And what a time to reflect on the state of the country and our place in it. As questions swirl around recent Supreme Court decisions, the January 6th hearings, and public health developments, you might wonder what you could do to contribute to how things in this country run. That's why this week for Hot SciComm Summer, I'm excited to share my chat with Taylor Scott. She's an assistant research professor at Penn State University, where she has two roles that connect her very well to this podcast series. One, she's the director of research translation in the Evidence to Impact Collaborative. And two, she's the co-director of the Research to Policy Collaboration. Essentially, Taylor spends a lot of time figuring out how to help researchers get their findings out of their labs in a way that can inform actual public policy. A lot of the topics we'll cover this summer on the Science Communication series are about interfacing with media to get science out to curious members of the public, like podcasting, writing, video producing. But another really important form of science communication is more strategic, translating research so that it can make a difference. So I was excited to talk with Taylor about the strategies developed in concert with the Research to Policy Collaboration and the unique challenges of connecting academic scientists with folks in government. I'm curious about how you got wrapped up in this. Like, what is your story in terms of like your background and why get into this position of thinking about translating research to policy?
Well, I describe my career path as a little serendipitous because in grad school, I was drawn toward more macro level social problems. Even, I don't know, maybe rewind the clock a little bit to undergrad, I was convinced I'm going to be a clinical psychologist. I was dead set on it. And I took a community psychology class that's helped me to think about the fact that problems are not merely individual, but they're also systemic. And so Bronfenbrenner levels of analysis, I thought, okay, cool. I can do more community-based work and have a bigger impact than I would with just one person at a time. I did end up getting accepted into a clinical psych PhD program, but intentionally focused on community psych. And eventually I ended up deciding I don't want to become a therapist. I didn't want to be licensed. And I really wanted to go all in on sort of more macro level problems. And I started to work on policy related things in a practicum as part of my coursework and quickly became a founding board member of the National Prevention Science Coalition, which really gave me sort of a good starting point in learning what role could we play as researchers in the policy space. And the serendipitous part is once you start to do policy work, people start to realize that you know things about policy. So they come and ask you to do more policy things. And so very early in my career, I became a leading voice in policy in my professional social circle. And so once I started working with the National Prevention Science Coalition in a paid role, the goal there was, all right, well, we know that from what the literature says, in 2014, Catherine Oliver, a colleague of ours, published a systematic review about how policymakers use research evidence. And the coalition I was working for said, oh my gosh, we need to do more relationships. Relationships between researchers and policymakers is what's missing in the world. Okay, how do you do that? And so we started with this really abstract concept that we need better trusting working relationships between our two communities, but didn't really have a structure in place to do that. And as a community psychologist, I wanted to think about it in terms of mobilizing the scientific community as a whole, as opposed to having, a handful of paid staff in the world who are science intermediaries. How can we really support community organizing of researchers themselves? And so that led to the Research to Policy Collaboration, where I started working on that with Max Crowley, and then we started to evaluate it at Penn State.
What surprised you in those early days of sort of like making a transition yourself? Like, were there things about the policy world that you weren't expecting, given the training that you had had before that?
I think that a big thing people who don't have much policy experience expect is that it's going to be super high stakes and controversial because that's what the media makes, they highlight the controversy. That's their job, to get viewers to pay attention to political issues. But I guess what's surprising for most people is that once you're actually involved in these meetings, they don't seem as high stakes as you might have initially thought of. You're oftentimes meeting with a staffer who's also early in their career, and you can have a relatively casual conversation about problems happening in the world. And, if you build that relationship, you can get asked to do more important high stakes things, but you don't get asked to do those things before the relationship starts.
So what are the kinds of ways in which research informs policy, right? Like in terms of thinking of that
Mhm.
expectations and, you think there's going to be really high stakes, but like on the ground, like what is often happening when policymakers are interested in like, what researchers have to say about this?
There's a well known typology in my field of study of how policymakers use evidence. Um, well known as air quotes there, I guess. But it's a typology that says that policymakers can use evidence in several different ways, including instrumental is using evidence in a really direct implications for policy development. Conceptual is a little more abstract about helping policymakers understand causes and consequences of about particular social phenomenon. And then you have tactical use, which researchers abhor, is more political, of like, oh, I already know what I want to do. Now I just need something that says I'm doing the right thing, like confirmation bias. When no one likes to be involved in that political process. If you're a researcher and you feel like try and true with the data, you're not wanting to cherry pick your evidence, right? And so what we found in our studies is that conceptual use actually seems to be much more of a natural role for researchers, in part because there's a saying in policymaking that there's no such thing as a new idea. And so these conversations are often not about telling policymakers some radically earth shaking idea of, you never thought of that, did you? It's more so about talking through what it could actually look like on the ground, or what the unintended consequences are about their policy ideas. And so that also fits really well with the researchers' typical preferences for their role, because because of researchers' preference to be more of a neutral source of information, they're less apt to say, hey, policymakers, this is what you should do about it. And they also tend to have more uncertainty to say, that's going to work. Like, here's the silver bullet to solve the world's problems. Because life is not that simple. And so it's having a conversation about complex problems that you might chip away at in different ways, which is a lot more conceptual than instrumental.
So one of the things I struggle with sometimes is thinking about like what actually, so these are sort of conceptually mechanisms through which research can inform policy, but like what are the kinds of research findings that matter to policymakers, right? Like maybe if you could give like an example or two of like, here's a case where some researchers had some findings, we connected them to policymakers who needed to know X, Y, or Z in order to, draft something. But like concretely, what does this look like?
Sure. Um, I like how you preface that, because I'm gonna flip it on its head. Instead of saying, "I'm a researcher, I have cool findings," the way that we go about it was we start with the end user. What do they need to know? That's a best practice that we try to incorporate into all of our research translation work, is by first understanding what are current goals, what's on the current policy agenda, and how can we involve the right researchers. Researchers have a hard time being at the right place at the right time, in part because they don't have the time to review what is on the current policy agenda. And so then we go and look for researchers who have those corresponding interest areas. I think a good example of that has been the work that we did around child abuse prevention. One of the people who I work closely with is Jenny Knoll in the P50 Center at Penn State for Child Maltreatment Research Center. And so Jenny and I talked about how child maltreatment, specifically the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, known as CAPTA, was up for reauthorization. And so we started by having meetings with the committee staff who were in charge of drafting the reauthorization language to ask what their interests were, what their goals were, what were their concerns, what were the barriers that they were facing. And doing those listening sessions helped us to be a lot more in tune with what they really needed. And so the House was majority Democrat at the time, and we were asked to do more synthesis of what costs were associated with child maltreatment versus the prevention programs. And that ultimately, the House invited us to do a testimony where those data were presented in the hopes that, the House wanted to reauthorize a bill that would provide more funding for prevention specifically and allocate funding in that direction, and their justification being, look, if you don't prevent child abuse, it costs more in social ills and other ways. On the Senate side, we had a corresponding relationship. At the House, the majority was Republican, so we worked with Senator Alexander's staff at the time, and that relationship. Through that relationship, we were asked to look more specifically at things related to sex abuse in particular, and look more closely at some of the legislation that they were hoping to present. We do not lobby. We explicitly do not lobby. And so whenever people ask us about legislation, we have to be very careful that we are not making specific recommendations on how to change it, but can summarize almost like a policy analysis of this is what the policy is going to do, and this is what research has to say about it.
It sounds like that example, anyway, sounds like at least some of this is using research to argue for priorities, right? So, like, we should prioritize such and such initiatives, like, because the data show that this is sort of like has a certain kind of impact. Is that kind of often how these take shape? Like, we're arguing for priorities?
That is a good example, but it really is dependent on the particular partnership where we're working. There have been offices that want to work with us on oversight. We've spent a lot of money on opioid crisis. How is that money being spent? Is it being spent in an evidence-based ways? Is it going to, the people who are opportunistic trying to, squeeze more money out of the government in ways that aren't effective? We've been asked about human trafficking prevention as an example, and someone in the Human Rights Commission included some of the research that we provided in an international memo. It just can go in a lot of different directions. Another person asked us about missing and murdered Indigenous women, and their main barrier was getting it on the policy agenda for the committee. And so we engaged researchers in writing an op-ed about it. That happened just before the pandemic, and then everything kind of switched focus entirely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I ask because I get the sense that there's maybe like an abstract interest among researchers in contributing to policy, but at least I don't have a clear sense of like what actually is the policy outcome that research could contribute to. So these are just helpful examples to even just get a sense of like what are the possibilities of using this. And one of the things that strikes me is a lot of these interests are fairly specific, which is in contrast to, at least like in my world of social psychology, we're often interested in understanding basic principles and sort of generalized understandings of like how people process certain kinds of information or engage in certain relationships. And I get the sense that policymakers, in the same way that you see this in other applied fields, are like, yeah, but like specifically, what does this have to say about my problem? So in your estimation, like how much of this is a translation process versus finding the actual evidence that is already specific to the issue of concern?
So if I'm understanding your question, you're wondering if it's about translating existing evidence or finding evidence that whether or not that exists.
Yeah, I guess I more mean like, sometimes researchers are interested in general questions that you could argue have something to say about these specific policy needs. But other
Ah,
researchers are very
I see.
committed to like understanding this actual specific, like this population, this specific issue.
Right.
Like how much are you drawing on people with specific expertise versus people with
Oh,
general
yes.
expertise that could be
Got it.
translated?
We certainly believe in team science in that, a diversity of scientific opinions can really improve the overall dialogue that's happening with the office. So we typically try to involve multiple researchers who have different experiences. I think that one thing we've learned in practice is that the legislative staff are fairly generalists themselves, so sometimes they don't know how specific or broad their research questions are. Sometimes it's as broad as, "How do you fix poverty?" And you're like, "Wow, okay, how am I supposed to tackle that? That's really broad." And then sometimes they're so specific that they're asking about anencephaly in indigenous communities, and there might be one researcher in the whole wide world that studies that. So, um, we find our sort of happy medium by bringing in perspectives on various pieces of those puzzles as opposed to, we so I think that part of the work is translation even of what are the questions the policymakers have and how can we tie that into the research community. I tell my employees that we're not just translating research for policymakers, we're also translating policy for researchers because we have to help researchers understand what are the programs and the kinds of questions and the agenda that policymakers have. Sometimes they're using entirely different language about pieces of legislation or policy programs that researchers have never heard of, even if they're studying the things that those policies are designed to do.
Yeah, so maybe we could take a step back and clarify a little more specifically, like what the research to policy collaboration is about, because we've sort of like hinted at it. But like, if you were to give your pitch, like this is what we do and this is how it works, what
Mhm.
would you say?
Yeah, the research policy collaboration is a replicable model that organizations can use to facilitate partnerships between legislative offices and researchers. It helps to connect researchers with the right offices at the right time that are interested in the work that they want to do. And it's done in a way that most researchers find is consistent with their educational mission because we also provide a lot of technical support around how to avoid lobbying and to be an honest broker um, of the evidence, providing different sorts of implications as opposed to sort of advocating for specific solutions, which legislators appreciate because number one, it's much more agenda neutral than anything that they're typically exposed to. And research from our academies and universities, we've found in our studies, legislators identify as being more credible than a lot of the research that's otherwise in the policy space from think tanks.
And so, like, how, like, actually, like, when you're connecting these two different groups together, like, what is that process like?
Sure. We start by identifying policymakers' priorities through a needs assessment. We'll ask, what are your goals? And we'll try to identify ways that researchers might be involved. And then we go to researchers who we identify as part of a rapid response network. Researchers enroll in the network, which allows us to have the equivalent of a virtual Rolodex. That's really important because going to a complete stranger in the research world, they're like, "Who are you? Why are you contacting me?" And it slows the process down by a whole month just to even demonstrate credibility with a researcher that we're a viable entity. And it also means that we're not having to go about searching every time we get a request across the internet of someone to find. We have researchers self select into saying, I study these things. And so we can sort of sort through our catalog and identify researchers who might have a relevant areas of expertise and can either say, here's some relevant information or research articles and maybe another person you should talk to. And when we do that, we try to synthesize enough to help aid in responding to the legislative interests area, but also it's an ongoing partnership development process where we try to help connect the researchers with the offices as a follow up. So that we have rapid response meetings where they meet and they talk about these issues and then try to strategize how to work together going forward so that ultimately you can end up with collaborations that lead to things like being asked to be speaking at a testimony or helping to provide model legislation, things that are a little more higher stakes than just the conversation. But the conversation itself is an important foot in the door.
Hmm. Yeah, and I want to get to tips and tricks for actually translating this into the language of policymakers. And to start, I think it's probably worth understanding what the differences are between the priorities of policymakers and the priorities of researchers. These are two different cultures, two different mindsets that if you're not careful can come to a head and nobody understands each other. So what are the differences between what you would say the priorities and goals and norms of researchers are compared to legislators?
Great question. There's been a lot of work published on this because it's called parallel universes or two communities where that we're living by very different norms. And so on the research community, we have a pretty linear sequence of how we create a research question, we design rigorous methods, and we study it. And that process can take some time. And then when we write about it, it's typically going into peer reviewed journals and maybe reports to our funders and things like that, conferences to our peers. It's often pretty insular focused. And I think that, the movement toward bringing some of our research into more of community and social impact work is sort of the wave that I want to ride, is trying to help universities have stronger social impact. On the policymaker side, their roles are involving a lot of stakeholders where research is just one consideration. Their number one consideration are the people who they represent. That is, by design, they are representing citizens in the United States in their districts. And so they care about what they have to think. The organizations or stakeholders otherwise who influence their constituents, and they care about anything that would impact them. So if research is going to be effective, it's often more effective when you can talk about it from the view of the constituency that the policymaker has. Whenever policymakers norms are often a lot more rapid fire than researchers because the agenda moves really fast. The policy window of opportunity is something that can really be a fleeting moment. That's how certain bills get passed very quickly. And if you're at the table, then you may have input. And by and large, researchers are not in those conversations. And the normative thing is that policymakers listen to the people who are coming to them to weigh in on these issues. And so it is not normative for a policymaker to intentionally seek out someone because they have enough people knocking on their door asking to meet. And so without some kind of intermediary to try to help broker across these worlds, you have a lot of different interested parties that are going to be at the table. And as the trope says, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. And that means being on the chopping block. So that's why, the advocacy scene is so crowded, is because a lot of professional societies and industries recognize that if they're going to have an impact on policy, that they have to be involved.
You said that these can be pretty fleeting. What does that mean? Days, weeks, months? How fleeting are we talking?
The policy process moves very fast. I'll give you an example, drawing back from the example that I gave on CAPTA. Whenever we were asked to do the testimony, we were asked within 2 weeks, can you travel? Can you write an official statement and speak for 3 minutes on the Hill? 2 weeks.
Hmm.
That's all you had in order to have someone physically in DC with official record on
Hmm.
like for your testimony. And that's just part of the process. It moves very fast. And whenever bills are being marked up, sometimes they only have 3 days to mark them up. And so if you're not at the right place at the right time, then you don't have those opportunities to be involved.
I get the impression from work that you and your colleagues have written that policymakers really do value like an empirical input, right? Like when it's there, it's like it seems desirable, it seems like this is good. How well do you see policymakers at being able to interpret research findings? Like I'm again just trying to sort of unpack what the communication challenge here is. Like biases, I don't want to say aptitude, but I think you know what I mean. But like how able are policymakers to actually like quickly understand what it means that researchers find X, Y, and Z?
Well, we work mostly with staff, and staff are not monolithic, like any community is not monolithic. So, your committee staff or your staffers who are working in roles where they've become kind of the go to expert of their field, they may be pretty knowledgeable already
Hmm.
and want more of a nuanced conversation or maybe even just a partner in their work that they do. It may not be that they need some earth shattering news about what causes human trafficking. It might be that they want someone who's going to help them provide the sorts of information that they can explain and express to their colleagues about what's going on, to help them to continue to be the credible source that they
Hmm.
aspire to be. I think that those really technical staffers are especially in committees or in specialized roles, like even caucus leaders can sometimes be very specialized and knowledgeable about the research in an area. Your average personal office staff is expected to handle somewhere between 3 and 5 different global policy issues, like between immigration and child and like social services. So that's a lot of breadth for one person to manage. So they're not often as specialized, and it can really just depend. I've had a conversation with a staffer before where they just wanted to understand what the process was like in how a parent's rights get terminated and how a child becomes eligible for adoption. And that wasn't a research conversation, but he trusted the researchers who were studying this process to help him understand bird's eye view of what was going on in the system.
This is very helpful because it breaks my stereotypes, which are that like, you know, there's sort of this like fast and loose, like, yeah, we got to get some science in here to back up what we're saying, and sort of like, you know, rife with possibilities of missing the gist or missing the impact or missing the nuance. But it does seem like it's like a legitimate interest in getting this information and like an interest in getting the nuanced take on it. That's what I'm hearing. Does that sound right?
If I can, I'll address an elephant in the room, and that is politics.
Oh, sure.
Like, there are certain things that research cannot change minds on. And it goes back to what is the representative's role? It is to serve the interests and the values and the beliefs of their constituents. And so, certain moral opinions that research is not going to change the opinion of that. And certain politicized issues that have become really cemented in party platforms, those are really hard. So, finding ways to work with a policymaker means figuring out ways that they would find it to be politically feasible to work on those issue areas. The good news is that a lot of the most bipartisan issues that there is ability to make compromise on, where research can make a difference, is that the media is not covering them. So the people who are outside the policy arena see all the dysfunction and they're like, oh my gosh, science is, there's a war on science. And I'm not going to say that there's not been an incredible movement to discredit science, especially in the pandemic. That's been very alarming for all of us. But there's a lot that can be done behind the scenes in ways that people don't realize. And I've had majority leaders recognize that that's the case, even if their bosses are not saying it on screen.
It also speaks to me to the value of the research to policy collaborate, like the system that you guys have, which is, like researchers themselves probably are thinking either what I do is irrelevant to policy, I'm not seeing it anything like what I do covered on the news. Also, if I did have anything to say, it would just be shot down because of politics. Whereas what you all are doing is going and identifying maybe some of those hidden needs for research input and facilitating those connections.
Absolutely. I mean, how often do you hear about the news coverage of even opioid policy? They're talking about a lot of opioid deaths, but they're not talking about, oh my gosh, some controversy in the act that's going to solve, overdose and fentanyl. That's not controversial enough.
So if we sort of zoom forward to okay, researchers have something to say potentially about things that policymakers are wanting to get a move on. In the process of actually synthesizing what the science has to say about it and conveying that in a palatable way, to the science communication side, what does that look like? What are best practices in communicating the science to policy?
One of the things that we do is we help researchers write fact sheets that we feel are close to what we can call best practice. I am really hypothetical like that because I am a researcher and a lot of science communication has not been rigorously studied. I'll say that, that's one of our team's unique niches is that not only are we doing the work, we are applying rigorous experimental methods to understand what is best practice. And so with the fact sheets, we typically recommend that they are under 2 pages. If it's 1 page, even better. Bullets, make it super skimmable. Be as actionable as possible. But if you're trying to avoid that lobbying rule, it needs to have more of a menu of different options of ways that policymakers could use it. And instead of saying, these are specific things that you should do, specific policies or specific programs that you should change in a specific way, how can you dial that back and think about the core constructs of what are the core things that would make a difference in people's lives? It's not Medicaid necessarily, it's healthcare access. So if we're focusing on more of what is that would really make a difference as opposed to a specific policy program, then that's something that we find to be more consistent with our sort of nonpartisan value. Then one of the things that we do, and I think this is the segue here, is that we do a lot of field testing of our fact sheets by disseminating them broadly across state and federal legislative offices and understanding if we write the message in a certain way, is it more likely to have broader reach? Can we increase the number of opens and clicks that legislative staff and their officials are attending to the information we're sending them through this platform? And one of the best practices we've identified in this research is that, consistent with this theory, I've told you, relationships matter. Mobilizing the scientific community matters, is that it was highly ineffective for us as an entity. The Research to Policy Collaboration has sent you this fact sheet. Oh, actually, we sent you a newsletter. We spent a lot of time making a beautiful newsletter that was HTML formatted, and it flopped. It was really great that we did this testing because we saw that not a lot of people were using it. And so then we said, what would happen if we had a researcher who authored the fact sheet send the email directly? Not only did it get open and clicked more often, it facilitated more interactions with researchers themselves, which is the goal. So if we had Luke email his fact sheet, you might have a couple of legislators who say, Luke, I'd love to talk to you about this more. Do you have time? And then it would schedule from there. I think we had some other sorts of, even one person was asking about legislative review of bills that they were working on, presenting to their constituents, attending a hearing. There were a lot of things that came out of that we didn't expect.
So making it more personal, person to person.
Yes, I am a huge proponent of a written piece of research synthesis is not standalone. It needs to be accompanied by a very strategic dissemination plan, and that means people are involved. Maybe you're bringing that piece of to meetings with you, and it's sort of something you can leave behind. Legislate before the pandemic, legislators were very old fashioned. I assume they still hold on to some of those norms. Is like the paper trail is something that they value, having a leave behind. Um, the the other thing that we've discovered is that if we can do it in this way, we may actually be able to have an impact by disseminating these fact sheets on how policymakers are using evidence. What I think was kind of interesting at the onset of this project is that our field in general has recognized just broad-based dissemination, pushing research evidence to policymakers is largely ineffective. It's because it's not relational and it's not always timely or relevant. And so we tried to adapt a dissemination model that would address those issues. And what we found is that state legislators were actually using more evidence language in their social media posts during the pandemic when we were doing this.
That was very cool. As you were saying it, I was like, "Oh, that's right." That was that very cool way that you were able to like show, like, how often can you do that, right? To show that this kind of communication isn't just like directly communicating information, but it's shaping a style of legislation, right, or an approach to putting these things together, right? And so like you're saying, like this was where you were able to track like individuals who would have received the kinds of communications that you were sending went on in social media to use language that was more like research shows or data suggests or, according to recent studies. And not even necessarily the ones like, I guess maybe you don't know if they were referring to exactly the information you were sending, but just sort of a general like shaping how the conversation plays out.
Sure. Well, we don't know exactly how they were referencing it because that was kind of beyond the scope of the study. When you have such a large sample size, it's really hard to do in depth coding. But using the linguistic markers that we used in the study, we did find that they were using more conceptual terms. So, back to that typology I mentioned before, things like using the words risk factors or disparities, the conceptual language that came out of the fact sheets was more likely to be used by 28% more posts contained those conceptual language. And 67 more posts were made whenever they using data and analytics language. So that was more like indicating the level of rigor of studies, whether what kind of studies they were. Um, what I think is also important to note is that we found a drop in use of language related to the production of science. Knowledge generation was our category. So things that were related to the the production of research, scientific generation, and dissemination. There was a lower likelihood of legislators in that group producing social media posts. We think it could be, are they calling for research evidence? Are they saying we need more evidence? Or maybe the availability of evidence in their inbox is making them less likely to call for more evidence.
So is this all related to the new scope thing? That's what this is?
Yes.
So maybe let's take a step back and
Rewind
you can sort
again.
of say
Sorry.
like, yeah,
Sure.
like what is this? And I get
Hmm.
the sense that you're excited about it. So what is exciting
Sure.
about it?
Hmm. So scope is the short name of the SciComm optimizer for policy engagement. It is the model that we're using to build onto relational approaches. It's not standalone in that we want to make sure that it's embedded in these relational approaches that we find to be best practices. But there are multiple other types of models that we could be using that essentially create an end product out of a partnership, timely partnership, making the evidence relevant. When the evidence is timely and relevant coming out of those partnerships, it may have the potential to be more effective and be disseminated through scope. And scope uses elements of continuous quality improvement, CQI, to do A B testing, the field testing, like the newsletter example, so that we can better shape our strategies for improving whether or not legislators are finding that this is a useful and relevant piece of information or a fact sheet. So it helps us to sort of study as we go how to improve the way that we communicate with policymakers. What I find exciting about it is that I just think that it's cutting edge way to use data in practice, which I'm just a super nerd about. I don't know, my whole graduate training was using program evaluation to inform change in action and in practice, and we're using a really embedded research design into our practice to help us refine and fine tune how we approach legislators and making a better use of everyone's time and making us more responsive to the legislature.
Yeah, what I like about it too is it seems like it's less of here are the handful of things that you ought to be doing to enhance your science communication. What it really is like a data-driven approach to effective science communication, right? It's not like a list of bullet points that you say you have to do these things. It's more like, here is how we get better at doing these things.
Of course, yeah. I like that.
So, I mean, in some ways, still, the challenge kind of that you alluded to is like convincing scientists to do this, like to take some of their time, right? Like if it's really a case of, hey, in 2 weeks, we have to get this stuff put together, otherwise it's not going to go anywhere. Like what are the challenges of getting researchers on board with this kind of work?
The number one barrier for researchers to do policy work is time. They have a lot of pressures to publish, to meet departmental needs, to respond to emails from students, a whole myriad of other things, service and academic related. And so, one thing I like to point out is that researchers and policymakers may live in different spheres in terms of certain norms, but they're also similar in more ways than you might realize because they're both really busy people who have their own types of technical expertise. And so, trying to sort of match these communities up means trying to provide a lot of support, administrative support, to even help make those meetings and conversations possible. And I think that that's the real niche that the RPC has played, is that we facilitate these partnerships and are successful in part because we try to take as much of the burden off of researchers as possible to being at the table and at the right time. Even whenever researchers are authoring fact sheets, oftentimes we have a pretty robust training program because so many junior scholars in our academies are interested and curious. Like maybe the beginning of our conversation was, what is policy? How do I get involved? What does this mean? I'm just curious. And so they start working with us to get a little exposure to policy. So a lot of times our trainees are trained on the fact sheet process and can work with researchers on trying to get a synthesis into a fact sheet format so that all the work doesn't have to get shouldered by someone who's just doing this on the side in their service time. I think that it's also important to point out that one of our frequently asked questions from legislators is, why are researchers doing this? Who's paying you? They want to know kind of the special interest of like why. And it's kind of a credibility thing that we can even say researchers aren't even getting paid for their time. They're just here because they want their work to matter and make a social impact. They want to make a difference. They want to help people. And so it kind of takes some of the I don't know, it helps boost the credibility that policymakers and researchers are on the same page about just trying to make a difference. Like that's why the legislative staff are there too. And that's why a lot of research is done, is because it's trying to unearth problems in the world, what's actually going on here. And so if you can help to build some credibility across those two worlds, then it's also another way that we're trying to sort of make this an easier process for researchers to not have to do all of the legwork just to even get a seat at the table.
Is the hope that this is like I mean, you referred to it as a replicable model, right? Is the hope that this is something that it's not just like one team of people organizing this for the entire country, but like as you're describing it, I sort of imagine like large universities having an office like this, right? That works in partnership with maybe their state governments and identifying policy initiatives, looking to see whether their internal faculty are doing work that's relevant and doing some of this facilitating. I guess like what kinds of conversations are you all having in terms of like, you know, what is it, scaling up or growing this and letting it sort of move beyond just your unit?
I love your vision. And we definitely see research centers as a partner in this work. How can we work with research centers across the country to even meet the social service mission of the university? Universities have even been at kind of a crossroads, I think. Even politically, you see trust in universities has become more partisan, in part if the theory in my research world is true, it's because there's a disconnect between the research and academies being in an ivory tower and not having enough relationships with the people they were supposed to be serving based on their land grant status. And so, as universities begin to recognize there are ways that we can provide a service to our state and the policymakers, then hopefully we will find more opportunities there to work in partnership with research centers. Currently, we do partner with several research centers, and that's been, a promising area of growth for us. I think that, most of our work has been done at the federal level, but we have done work at the state level in partnership with the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living at University of Texas in Austin. And they were our first pilot of doing it, replicating the research policy collaboration in the state level. And now we're writing a grant to study basically the same outcome study that we did at the federal level by randomizing Congress. Can this work? Yes, it can. But can we do it at the states? And randomizing 30 states as to whether or not they can make a difference in substance use prevention policy in particular is how we're thinking about it next. We've also thought about international work because we're just, you know, ambitious like that, I guess. So we've been having some conversations with people in different countries, including Australia Prime Minister Office, about how they might adapt components of the model because their governance structure is very different than ours. So it would require a lot of adaptation because it's not as legislative focused as it is administrative executive branch type focus policy.
So just by way of wrapping up, let's say someone listening to this is a researcher, him or herself, and they say, this sounds great. I would love to know that what I'm doing could potentially have this impact. What would you encourage individual researchers to do if they are hoping that they could sort of use what they're doing to have this bigger impact?
Sure. Well, first, I would love to get contact information for anyone who wants to be involved so they can sign up on our website and we can make sure to call upon them if their research interests come up in some of the work that we're doing. We try to minimize the irrelevant things in people's inbox and just call upon them when their time is right on a specific issue. The other thing is that it doesn't have to be, the research to policy collaboration. I think the key thing for researchers is to find intermediaries that they can get involved with in general. I think that there are lots of great intermediaries. Some are nonpartisan, some are very partisan. So, in terms of someone's reputation, they want to consider who they're affiliating and associating with. And sometimes researchers don't care if they're perceived as partisan, and that's okay if you want to just understand what your role is in terms of. I have actually a different recorded video about, do you want to be raging against the machine like Bill Nye, or do you want to be someone who would be otherwise behind the scenes if it weren't for the pandemic, Anthony Fauci? There's different roles that we can play as in science policy, and trying to understand what hat you want to wear is an important question for the kind of relationships that somebody wants to build.
Great. And if they want to know more about research to policy collaboration, where should people go?
Our website is www.research2 policy.org. And there's a tab for researchers at the top of the menu.
Great. Well, this has been great. And I want to just say thank you for taking the time to walk me through it, reveal to me the ways in which science can inform policy, and hopefully people will reach out with their own expertise.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it. I appreciate the opportunity.
Big thank you to Taylor Scott for taking the time to share her story and giving us a look at the research to policy collaboration. The website for that, again, is research2policy.org, research2policy.org, or check out the episode webpage for a link. This summer series on science communication is a special presentation of my podcast, Opinion Science, a show about the science of our opinions, where they come from, and how they change. You can subscribe any old place where they have podcasts, and be sure to check out opinionsciencepodcast.com for links to things that came up in the episode, as well as past episodes of the show, transcripts, links, all that stuff. And once again, you can help spread the word about the podcast and this science communication series specifically by sharing it on social media, passing it along to your SciComm loving buddies, and leaving kind reviews of the podcast online. If you manage a newsletter for science communication resources, or you're part of a science writing group, anything like that, those would be great channels to spread the word about this. I'm really excited about the summer series, and I would love for people who are interested in science writing, science to policy, science communication, to find it. Okie doke. Thank you so much for listening. Happy American Independence Day. Do the things, watch a parade, fire up the grill, look at some fireworks, and I'll see you back here next week for another form of strategic science communication.
So it really is thinking about all the stuff that I know, all the kind of amalgamation of studies and findings and whatnot, thinking about the audience that I'm communicating with and what they're most motivated by and what they most need to hear, and then creating that link between their lived experience and what the data tell you to create a strategy, an outcome, an action that they can take so that it's always very tangible and behavior-based. Hi, my name is Dr. Evelyn Carter. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the president of Paradigm, a diversity, equity, and inclusion company.